It wasn't supposed to end this way. I wanted him to love me. All I ever wanted was Edward's affection, to be her replacement. But now the hair is everywhere, binding me, choking me, pulling me towards something dark. My name was Cora. A parlour maid in a grand house, nothing more. I fetched trays, polished silver and tented fires. But Edward, my master, was different. At least, I thought he was. He took me into his room, his bed, with hands that burned like they belonged to someone who cared. For a while, I believed it. I thought if I loved him enough, he'd leave her, Lady Mary, and take me as his own. But he didn't love me. He never would. His eyes softened only for her. Even in those final moments, with her body cold on the drawing room floor, poisoned by my hand, Edward wasn't free of her. The morning after Mary's funeral, I stole the scissors from the sewing box and snuck into Edward's study. They said he had cut a lock of her hair before her burial, a memento to be woven into the frame of her memorial portrait. I found it lying on the desk, her long auburn strands bound in silk ribbon. It shimmered under the light like molten copper, thick and heavy as though still full of life. I shouldn't have touched it, but I couldn't stop myself. When I held the hair in my hands, an idea took root, a spell. Mary had won Edward somehow. Perhaps she had enchanted him. She always carried herself like she owned him, with that book of hers tucked away at the back of her vanity, a little book black as night, filled with whispered spells of love and binding. It had to be the reason. I was sure of it. I tore a page from the book, a spell to twine the heart of one man to another woman's soul. All it required was a piece of the other woman, her hair. At first, the strands resisted. It felt strange, wrong, as I braided them into my own hair. The plait grew longer than it should have, heavier with each loop. When I was done, my head felt tight, as though her hair were stretching across my scalp like creeping vines. That night I lay in bed, the soft hum of Edward's breath in the room above. I knew he would call for me soon, just as he had on so many nights before. But this time would be different. This time, it wouldn't just be for his pleasure. He would love me. He had to. But the house was silent. Edward never came. Days passed. I waited by his door, listening to his sorrow spill out in soft murmurs. His fingers traced Mary's portrait every night, his whispers wrapping around the memory of her. He wept for her, for a woman already in the ground. He never called for me again. The hair on my head began to grow faster than before. Every morning I woke to find new strands woven into the braids, thick and coppery. It wasn't mine. It was hers. I could feel it tightening around my scalp, spreading through my head, binding me. Then came the singing. At first I thought it was just in my dreams, soft, melodic, Mary's voice drifting through the halls. But then I began to hear it when I was awake. It came from nowhere and everywhere, a lullaby laced with spite. I begged Edward to notice me, but his gaze slid past me as though I were part of the wallpaper. I tried touching him, but his body flinched away, cold as stone. All he wanted was that damned portrait and the lock of hair woven into its frame. The hair on my head had grown unbearable by then. It curled down my shoulders, heavy as chains. In a panic, I grabbed a pair of scissors and hacked away at it, cutting off a thick ponytail. I thought that would be the end of it. But the strands came alive in my hand, twisting, writhing as though possessed. They slithered up my arm like snakes, coiling around my wrist, pulling tight. I screamed, shaking my hand, but the hair slithered higher, twisting into ropes. It was Mary. She was here, in the hair. I stumbled backward into the linen closet, panting, heart racing, but the hair had a will of its own. The door slammed shut behind me. In the dark, I felt the strands crawl across my skin, winding around my neck. I tried to scream, but they squeezed tighter, so tight I couldn't breathe. The last thing I heard was Mary's song, soft and mocking, as the hair pulled me off my feet. My legs kicked, useless, as the strands knotted into a noose and hoisted me upward. They found me hanging the next morning, my body swaying from a loop of braided hair. Edward never wept for me. His eyes remained on the portrait, where Mary's face smiled sweetly, her hair woven into the frame like golden ivy. I was buried in a potter's field, unmarked and forgotten, while Mary's portrait hung proudly in the grand house, her memory forever bound in braids of copper. And as for Edward, he would never escape her. Not truly. Her hair would always be there, waiting, growing, binding, and her song would never end.